Well, I'm sort of stunned. I'm used to being on panels where people drone on, you know, and then you're out of time, so there's nothing left to discuss. You guys have done a great job. So, with permission of the chairs, it would seem like we've got till 10:45. We spent half the time on the moderated discussion, then opened it up. I think there's some people in the audience who probably can be pretty good provocateurs. Not that you all need that. But maybe the first question I have is if we agree that at least some significant part of evidence generation needs to come from real-world evidence, you know, with or without randomization, what are the main limiting factors now? What's keeping us from moving into it? And a subsidiary part of that is, do you agree with me that this is an industry that's getting less efficient, not more efficient over time? And if so, why is that happening?
Shall I have a go at that, Rob? I mean, the answer's demonstrably yes, it's getting less efficient, and you showed the data. And I think the reasons for that are complex, but definitely involve a reluctance to change. And I think the reluctance to change is driven by a series of assumptions about what somebody else might think. So, you know, you can blame a regulator or you can blame somebody else in the process. The fact is, I think there's a lot of desire for change at the top of organizations, and there's a lot of resistance wrongly as you go down organizations because they assume that somebody else wants something different. I come back to the point that I think the more we can put at the forefront of this, what's the question you're trying to answer, the technique just becomes a tool to answer that question, and people get worked up on whether you're allowed to use electronic health records or real-world data. The answer is, does it answer the question you're asking? And if it does, the regulators, I'm sure, are as keen to get that data as any other data. But I think change resistance is high.
I mean, I think a big lesson we learned in Sentinel, and I think it's something we spent a lot of time talking about this year, is what are the business models that are going to feel threatened by a change? Because if we can't address that, then the incentive to continue along the path we're on is not insurmountable, but it's a high hurdle.
The cost and the time spent in gathering the data, and we want more data, have really not become much more efficient. And that was the one point that in your opening remarks, Rob, I disagreed with. You said something about the electronics medical system is there, it's ready to allow us to efficiently extract data. Well, trying to get data out of electronic medical records is challenging. Many of the data elements have really just been like a paper chart dump into a digital format. They're not searchable. It takes a skilled person to review all these data elements to put them into a national registry. So it's not like press the button and we have all this data upload to a national analytics center. It's very, very inefficient at this point, and a lot of that goes back to the genesis of electronic medical records, were more for hospitals to increase their efficiency in documentation for billing, et cetera, not for improving the quality of care, not for uploading data to national registries or other research or just quality control efforts.
I would agree with John and also with Patrick. I think it is, what is the question? Just as John said, electronic medical records were designed for one purpose. They now have a new purpose, and that purpose is to collect data that would help in terms of being able to look at post-market effect of drugs as well as devices, but they're not constructed that way. So let's just pretend, let's say Google, or let's say Amazon, these huge corporations were run the way healthcare is run, where it's driven by one question, and there's the ability to allow 1,000 flowers to bloom. So you have all these companies out here designing electronic medical records with some regulation in terms of trying to satisfy meaningful use, but no other guidelines besides that. So what is it going to take now to take that and turn it around so that electronic medical records standardly allow for the collection of extended information. And I think Patrick is very right. It goes beyond just medical collected information. You also need to collect information about where the person lives, income, all those types of factors that have an influence on the effect of that treatment, so that those who have several comorbidities or other types of factors get included into the database. Then they all have to be combined. There has to be something that allows all those electronic medical records to come together and be able to produce the information. There was a little product that has grown quite a bit in the last years. It's called Patient Like Me. It's a database that was constructed by consumers who actually took consumers' reported symptoms and began to correlate that data to help consumers to find patients that have similar symptoms and also treatments and look at their outcomes. If you saw the New York Times magazine this past week, there was a great example of a case where a person had an illness. They've gone to one provider after the other, repeated MRIs, tests, but could not find the answer. The answer was given when someone who knew her knew someone else that had the same symptoms, and they collaborated together and then found the physician that had treated the friend successfully, and that's where that person's journey in terms of high-cost medical care ended. If we want to do this, we have to be very strategic, we have to be very focused, and if there's laws in the way, we need to take a look at those laws and figure out how to change. Because this is costing, and I hate to keep bringing the cost factor here, but that's where the American public is. The public is saying we can't handle this any longer.
This has been yeah, Joe?
I just wanted to agree with the panelists about that. I think there are inefficiencies right now. Basically, we have a number of large databases, large data systems that don't communicate very well. So I think having some broad integration standards, and we have lots of claims data. I think we're trying to use that more as a source of information for perhaps even clinical uses. So.
I just want to mention one point, which is that I think that those examples that you gave, the data that can fall between the cracks from patients, I think that that has to be a key part of the strategy as well. Outside of the records, outside of all the data that's collected in typical fashion, the data that can make the difference between a diagnosis that won't necessarily be recorded, which we rely on the patient, we rely on the consumer to give us that information, would entail some real aggressive new techniques to be able to properly engage them in new collection methods to be able to get that data. And I think that that's going to be a tricky element of the strategy to be able to figure out how to best do that, to be able to better engage consumers from what we've done so far.
Well, these have been great comments, but you all have brought back early traumatic wounds that I have. In 1978, when we were first working with computerized information systems, there was, I still remember shouting matches about the question of whether the record was primarily for timely transactions or for collecting data to allow analytics for inferences to be made. And of course, the answer is sort of both, but I think throughout the course of the day we're going to hear views about a fundamental question there is how much energy do you spend on the upfront regimentation of data collection versus curating data on the back end. Because John, I mean, as you well know, clinicians on the front line usually can't get access to the data warehouses that their administrators are actually using pretty routinely now to make decisions. And as payment systems are changing, the punishment for making decisions that don't have particular health outcomes are going to be more and more substantial. So I think an interesting question to me is where should the energy be spent trying to get people to collect pristine data up front or curating data on the back end? Rachel, yeah.
I think we answered that question in Sentinel. We took data not intended for the purpose we were using it, so secondary use, and we cleaned it up and we got something good. We didn't get something perfect. We got something good that's a useful tool. And it should, and it has, helped push both data quality and the use of those kinds of data for those purposes forward. So I think we want to try and make improvements before we have a perfect source of data.
Yeah.
A little bit here, because I know you can fire back pretty readily. When I'm dealing inside the FDA and with industry, there's a view that if a study coordinator collects a piece of data, somehow it's correct because it all matches up when the data set comes in. But we did studies years ago that showed that often things are missed, and that the richness of data, if you have multiple sources, it may show you inconsistencies, but the inconsistencies are actually often real. How do you think about this? Because I think one of the big impediments is the view that this is bad data.
So I completely agree. And we've moved quite a long way, not far enough, but we've moved quite a long way from the purity of source verification versus knowing whether data has an abnormal distribution or something that tells you there's a problem with the data itself, whether it's an abnormal digit preference or abnormal variance or something that tells you the data is unusable in some way or there's something that needs to be looked into. So I think we need to move away from the purity of source verification for every single thing to questioning, are you happy that you've got a data set which has enough robustness to be usable for the task you have in hand? And then if I can just answer on the previous question a bit, I mean, when we did the study I referred to 15 years or so ago, we found there were 120 different definitions of myocardial infarction in the database. So there's a bit of both of cleaning up entry, which needs to happen in routine care, but there's also, I think, a real risk in assuming that you can clean up the data entry perfectly and you can clean up the interoperability by having a single source system, which I think is incorrect. And there are technological solutions to both of those, which I think are the bigger thing to push for.
Rob, I would vote for an upfront improvement in the infrastructure of gathering the data because I see a great opportunity to reduce healthcare costs there. We waste a lot of time. Yesterday I saw a patient and electronic medical records from 3 different systems came to me, but they had to be printed out, faxed, or mailed. And so there was a lot of waste there. The images that came or didn't come some of them were DICOM compatible, some were not. That leads us to repeating studies like echocardiograms, and certainly many of these patients have had 10 echocardiograms in the last year. There's so much money to be saved by improving the efficiency of sharing data between providers. That, I think, will help drive the completeness and the quality of the data for downstream uses.
So, John, Joe, go ahead, and then I have another question for John related to.
So I think I want to just mention that the individual or entity that's responsible for actually entering the data has been a question not only at the initial point of service, but I think we've seen some difficulty in actually obtaining downstream follow-up in this type of data. It's like who is responsible to actually enter specific outcomes after, whether it's procedural, implantation or a device, and that's, I think, an issue that we've seen. And I think the question is raised is that, in that case, who is responsible to actually be entering the data after an initial visit?
Well, so John, my question in a way sort of relates to that, in that you're a big proponent of registries, and I am too. And registries are one way to bring discipline to upfront data collection where you can do it, but there are also problems. We have, I was at NORD yesterday, National Organization for Rare Diseases, 5,000 untreatable genetic diseases in the U.S. right now. If each one has a registry, the cacophony of registries could be substantial. So, and then we have other areas that are not so specialty driven, mental health, hypertension's another good example. How do you see the registries playing into this? Because one thing that bugs me a little bit is when people talk about real world evidence, they often don't bring registries up, and yet registries are sort of in the middle, aren't they? Because it's a structured collection of data that can be very useful, but frequently they are real world. They're collected on everybody that comes in with a diagnosis or a problem.
Registries are simply a repository of data that should be efficiently extracted, and given that commonality of the purpose of such an infrastructure, there should be a diversity of registries for different purposes, for different diseases, for monitoring different things, but there shouldn't be an inefficiency in a siloed aspect to those registries if they in fact are able to extract from the same electronic medical record the key data elements. So I think we have to be careful about registries kind of becoming not understanding that they simply are a very efficient, can be an efficient mechanism of collecting data for specific analytic reasons for a variety of stakeholders. And so I think we should be able to expand the use of registries looking at it from that standpoint.
And I know cardiology registries are, have a longer history than most other areas, but for sure, both you and Joe could comment on this, but when I look at bundle payment as a mechanism, which is now, even cardiology, oncology, one of the issues that brings up, so I think health systems are going to be very incentivized to collect the follow-up data, because if they don't know what's happening in follow-up, they're going to run a big risk of losing out in the payment system. Do you see that bundle payments with follow-up as part of the payment being what's happening with registries and systems in that regard?
I think we're learning to collaborate, and with CMS as an example. It's easy for a hospital, for a provider to gather data for the initial treatment, but the long-term outcome is much more challenging, especially with this being a referral population in many of these areas. And that's where the partnership we've formed with CMS in the TVT registry has been critical for looking at 1 year, 2 year, multiple year outcomes. Who's rehospitalized, for what reason, who's alive, who's not alive. This is the way we need to develop this network of registries and overcome these barriers of how we can communicate and share these data. And how we do that does require some overarching governance structure, some with all stakeholders being at the table. Joe?
Yeah, I agree, and I think that's a good example. So some of the difficulties is actually that specific issue about the long-term follow-up. So in terms of bundle payments, or even in terms of the value-based sort of payment mechanisms, that is vital, of course. It's just how and who's responsible to do that right now. I think majority right now it is still in a traditional system of fee-for-service, and then we have some potential data quality issues with that. So I think we're actually learning, but it's not complete to really, I think at this point, to be able to make some more definitive sort of conclusions out of the data.
Rhonda?
Yeah, I just want to say with bundle payments or shared savings, the dynamics become the same, because individuals are looked at, or provider systems are looked at in terms of the outcomes. And the outcomes right now, frankly, many times are based on process and procedure, and not as much on objective data that actually dictates an outcome. So, for example, for a diabetic, is the hemoglobin A1C less than 7 the actual outcome? So I think there's some holes there. I do think that talking about learning systems, which I think John is talking about, where you have registries are going to be great, but they need to be interactive, because the physician or the nurse or whoever's making those decisions are making decisions in the moment. So it needs to be tied to something that is correlated. I'm not a scientist, okay, and I'm not a statistician, but it needs to be it needs to have that data correlated to create the information. As providers, those who've gone through science, you know that nothing is ever pure. And you're going to look at the percentages, you're going to look at the correlations, and you're going to make a decision from that. That is far better than a physician or a nurse looking at their own population and their own treatment methodology to determine from that N of 100, their N of 5, what decision they should make with their next patient. If I was to put my money on something, it would be registries, and it would be interactive. And sometimes the information is not going to be right, but it's going to be far better than making decisions based on an N of 5, meaning those are the only patients you've seen, versus having access to more data that gives you correlations and probabilities in some way.
When you say interactive, do you mean interactive with other sources of data, or do you mean decision support, that is giving...
Both,
okay.
Because the larger the data set, the more likely you're going to get viable information.
All right, I can't resist taking a tangent here while I have you experts here. One of the common questions I get in certain fora is, should the FDA be regulating decision support? Just a quick, rapid answer.
If that means there would be some standardization of process, standardization of data collection, if the FDA is the right entity to do that, then I would say yes. The standardization to me is the most important, because then you begin to have at least a basis from which you can begin to do something with the data. It always has to change. It has to be dynamic, because you look at what you have and you keep evaluating and figure out what else you need to have. But there needs to be some type of standardization. Leaving this to the industry, leaving this to, the 1,000 flowers blooming is not going to get us there. And again, I'll just keep reiterating, we're at that ceiling point where we can't go any higher.
I actually think the FDA should. I think there are some similar instances where the FDA does with, for example, with the computer-assisted, sort of diagnosis software in terms of imaging. So I think it helps. I mean, the issue of really having approval and then really confidence in the analytic validity, the clinical validity of a specific diagnostic is very important for us anyways.
Yeah, it's not really my domain, but I'm going to comment on it anyway, because it seems to me, from years practicing as a clinician, that you're moving from a position of individual random decision-making to one which is data-based. I mean, random's too strong, I know, but I mean, it's individual. And I think, therefore, regulating this needs to be done with an extremely light touch, appropriate response. Otherwise, you almost couldn't get worse than where we are currently. And if you overlay regulation on this too heavily, I think you'll actually be the enemy of the good.
John, you were going to come.
I think it's in the last week you released the draft document for FDA requirements for software requirements, and that would be appropriately applied to decision-making software without FDA crossing the line into practicing medicine, regulating practice of medicine versus regulating devices and software packages.
Yeah, you guys are great, because I'm going to get to recording this, because you actually filled in all the blanks. And yeah, I mean, as some of you know, we're on the record as saying for decision support, it's very light touch, if any. But obviously, if the decision is, does your defibrillator fire in an automated way, then we're heavy touch. That's going to be regulated. But we think there needs to be ferment in this field, much along the lines of what Patrick said. Most decision-making now is arbitrary. It's not even as good as random. Random actually is designed whereas arbitrary is based on what you had for breakfast and how you feel that day, and did you get along with a person, in front of you, and all that sort of stuff. And decision support, I think, can fix that, but as Rhonda said, unless there's some standards to it, you end up with chaos in a way. And what I've also said is, I think as decision support gets better and it begins to take off and it's really used, we will find that there are areas that need to be regulated, because when it has consequences, when large numbers of people are making decisions based on an algorithm, you need to be pretty confident that algorithm is correct. But anyway, I mean, I think of it as a large part of what we're talking about today is trying to get to a learning health system where randomization is part of it, but it's a continuous feedback system in the vein of decision support, which I thought Rhonda described beautifully. Jeff?
Just wanted to add, I think as we get more into this area, and with FDA and also with CMS, that sort of the input of the patient is extremely important. I think we've noted that and we've seen that in some of the FDA decisions, and also in what we've been trying to expand in terms of patient shared decision making, and actually involving what the patient preferences are, specifically when you actually have equivalent types of technologies being developed for some very traditional conditions.
The issue, I'll just tell you, one of the more frustrating things, in a sort of a fun way, is when I've worked with CMS and with the administration, the goal is to move to value-based payments as much as we can. And then the question is, how many therapies do we have where we can actually calculate the value of the therapy, despite the fact that we're spending $60 billion a year on clinical research globally? And the answer is not many. And Rhonda again pointed it out nicely. We have a lot of process things we can measure, but actually the value of therapies in terms of outcomes, not so much. Why is that?
Well, some of the value is going down Mr. Frankel's route, is the value to the patient in terms of improved quality of life, improved functionality. And we've done a poor job of assessing that in the past. In cardiology, we used the New York Heart Classification, which was not very good, but moving to something like standardized walk tests, to KCC questionnaires about functional state, that is allowing us, I think, to really look at before and after a treatment. What is the change from the patient's perspective? That spells out in some very important economic ways and correlates with like rehospitalization and the ability for them to maintain independent lives. So that's part of, I think, the value proposition we're starting to get better at, but we've only begun.
I think we have a paucity of information in most cases where we're looking at it because we're not collecting the data, and I don't think we look at it through a patient lens very often as well. I think that's the big struggle, and you can see this to an extent in the difficulties NICE have had in the UK of trying to make these evaluations. In the absence of evidence, the danger is you delay rather than actually do something in the healthcare system to generate the evidence to try and back it up and adjust accordingly. And I think that's really where we need to move to.
Just to pick up the point of Dr. Carroll with the cardiological lens, something that I've come across a number of times are patients after they have a surgical procedure, after they have cardiac surgery, the difference between the patient who has outpatient, goes to an outpatient rehab program and the one that doesn't, and the potential impact on even one-year mortality in those, and that sometimes, again, is below the radar because that's not always being looked at. The cardiologist is reviewing the cardiological information, the cardiothoracic surgeon is seeing whether the surgery went well. After that point, after the hospital discharge, there could be remarkable differences for each individual patient depending on the path that they take afterwards, and that information I think is essential, and uniformity obviously is important and sometimes is missed because those referrals might not be made, and if they are made, that data might not be captured.
Yeah, just a comment. I think one of the amazing things now is that a lot of that information can be captured now directly from patients because of social media and personal devices, as people have pointed out. So I think this is going to be a big area. We're certainly interested in having people take advantage of that information. It begs the question, of course, where I think it's patently obvious that differences in post-hospitalization care make a huge difference in outcomes, and then the question of what you do about it is another question.
And we're really not gathering the data to understand some of the key modifiers. And I think Rhonda expressed something that I think is very important: the social, economic, cultural, educational background of patients often is the main determining factor whether someone goes on to cardiac rehab or not. They don't have transportation to go to rehab, or there's a copay, or other barriers that we may not think of, but are tightly linked to the individual characteristics of that patient and their background and their family.
John, it is being measured, just not by practitioners. That data exists on everybody. If you don't believe it, just go to the Democratic and Republican parties and ask them how much they know about every single one of us, about everything that you just mentioned.
So the TVT registry has to link with the Democratic database.
I could give you a whole bunch of other sources,
Okay.
but believe me, the data's for sale about all of us in that regard.
I was just going to say, I agree with what the other panelists say. So let's go back to Patrick, who said, what is the question? What is the purpose of healthcare? Is the purpose of healthcare to cure, or is it to get people functioning again? So if the answer is functionality, then we've missed the mark. We are not measuring that at all, and maybe that's something that we need to take a look at and make that standardized in some way. Because when you look at various situations, patients, let's take oncology patients. Some patients decide that they're not going to undergo chemotherapy, surgery, whatever, because they value the quality of their life and what they perceive. But that doesn't come out necessarily in an electronic medical record right now. And it's a discussion that if the doctor doesn't have it with the patient may not even express that or make those kind of decisions. So it may be, if we feel that the purpose of healthcare is to really be patient-centered and to help them to be functionable in the way that they want to be functionable, then maybe that's the goal that we should be striving towards.
Can't resist a comment on that. I mean, one of the exciting things now is that many of us have been in these discussions for decades now. I can say that now that I'm a Medicare recipient. So it's been decades. But it's real now one manifestation is, if you look at the cancer, the Moonshot Blue Ribbon panel, one of the 10 priorities is integrating patient-reported outcomes and quality of life functionality measures into electronic records. So I think there's momentum building for the things that you're describing, but we're obviously not there. But let me pick on Rachel for a minute here. The mantra at FDA has been, you should take a drug and it should get on the market because it causes you to live longer, feel better, or be more functional. So aren't we requiring the companies measure functionality? And why is there this dissociation between the FDA regulatory studies and this apparent gap in the information people need to understand therapies with regard to functionality?
Okay, so if it's you feel function and survive, right? So that's what we measure as clinical benefit. And this is, of course, you're alluding to a conversation you and I have been having for about 10 years or more, where you make the point that FDA has far more than just a bully pulpit. Obviously, for those working for some pharmaceutical industry, if the product is not marketed, and first, it can't benefit anyone, but it also can't be sold. You ask a hard question because FDA has a number of periods during the development of products during which it can be influential. I believe that the most influential where FDA has the most influence is very early in development for the companies that decide to take advantage of that. And as is true in any big organization, it's not consistent in all domains, but that's where one can really influence the scope and direction of development. And we see this working extremely well, usually in the areas that you mentioned, where there's a life-threatening or a serious life-threatening disease, no satisfactory alternatives, and everyone is in a rush. So that's when the system works well and FDA works well. When the system, in my opinion, does not work so well is when a new drug application, so in this case we're talking about drugs, gets dumped on a reviewer's desk and it's a fait accompli. And then what exactly do we do? Absent well, I'm not a food and drug lawyer, but, and this would be a really interesting conversation to have with a bunch of food and drug lawyers, but absent a safety problem, if the drug has been proven to be effective and the risk-benefit is appropriate, even if it answers just a very tiny, narrow question, the letter of the law has been met. So I think the more we can shift the conversation to earlier in development, that's one. But two, I think what we're not quite discussing here is, or we are a little bit, it's the outcome. The outcome of the FDA's patient is the population, the outcome for the population, and how do we shift everyone so that Patrick and Stephen and others trust us when we say, do it a little differently this time, it's going to be fine. The first time for a company is somewhat nerve-wracking. Was that your question?
That was a great answer, also partly because it takes me back to Patrick. So Patrick, what goes on in those secret meetings in the pharma companies? Because surely you would like for your medicines to be proven to have value for patient outcomes. And yet we're hearing from the audience that, and I can just tell you from the CMS perspective, it's not a decision I have to make like CMS does, so I'm just hearing it from them. When they actually say, we want to implement value-based pricing, they can't find much of anything where they can actually do it because the evidence isn't there. So what's the disconnect here?
So I think there is definitely a more rigid approach to looking at regulatory approval that is necessary. So in other words, the teams, I think in general, would like to go with what's been done before. So not on my project, please, do it on somebody else's project, which I think is a fundamental issue where leadership needs to take the ownership of that risk and say, yeah, we will do it on that project, we will take the risk. I don't think it's anything like as big a risk as people perceive it to be. And then I think there's a reality of collecting some of this information is difficult. So much of what I see of patient-reported outcomes and so on are not really what we're talking about here, where you're talking about continuous measurement with wearable devices. It's still rather formulaic, paper-based systems which don't get you what you need particularly. So I think there's a technology thing which is changing quite rapidly. And then there needs to be a willingness, I think, in the regulatory process, which I believe is there in principle, to say, we'll look at that and we'll use that data and we're not going to hold you to what the last 20 approval endpoints were. We're prepared to look at a different endpoint. I think that's key to this.
It was a Glaxo development. I don't even know if it was Glaxo Welcome at that point or Glaxo, and it were patients, industry, and FDA, and this goes back to 3TC, where that was the first product approved on the basis of HIV RNA, and so the company did take a risk, and it changed the entire field.
Well, and, frankly, we've taken a risk with a study you'll hear about later on the Salford study. I mean, that was quite a big risk to do that study, and it was answering a question that you could only answer in that way. And I think, those sorts of risks need to be taken if we're going to make change the way we're doing this.
I know that many feel that patient-centered drug development is somewhat new, but it was patients back then who said, we're following our RNA levels, and we are not going to go into a mortality trial. We simply won't do it. And it was a very reasonable patient-centered decision to make.
Well, so just for the record of this not official National Academy of Medicine policy meeting, Patrick, I mean, you're senior enough to just say this, and industry people often don't. I mean, you sort of implied that one of the problems is the review groups at FDA may not give companies the confidence that if they take a risk that it's going to be rewarded. Or honored. So what? Just say a bit about that, because I think
that doesn't sound like a danger zone at all, Rob. I think it's on. Yeah, I think it's on both sides. I don't think it's as simple as the teams in the FDA won't go for it. I think it's quite likely that what happens is that a team from industry goes and says, we're thinking of doing it this way, which would usually be the conventional way, and the reply is, yes, that's the good way to do it, we know how to deal with that, and that's the interaction that may take place. So then, to try and challenge that, you've already got feedback to say we like it this way because we've seen it this way before. When you go with something new, I think it's very much the answer is going to be yes at your risk. And then you've got a nervous team saying, well, why would I take this risk when I know what the conventional path is? Which is why I think it comes down to leadership on both sides, actually, to say take the risk and hold hands on it as you go forward, and take the accountability at a senior level, because you can't expect the team itself, or indeed I suspect teams embedded within the FDA, to take that risk and guarantee that they're going to accept a new endpoint.
I really agree with that, and I don't see any way around it, and it's from years of experience on the other side of the fence and now seeing the inside of the FDA. You know, there's understandable concern, I would say, on both sides, that if you take the risk and things go bad, you know, it'll be it's not even necessarily you'll get blamed, it'll be your fault, because people involved in drug development are, you know, in my experience on both sides, very highly motivated to do good things for patients, and if they screw up, it's concerning.
But I think you can argue we're screwing up on a massive basis now. If we think of our
I completely agree with that.
Okay, so one is a, if you will, sin of omission versus sin of commission, or however one says that. Right? We are making a mistake on a daily basis. We're not measuring care. We're worried about billing, and we're looking at endpoints that we think are safe, but we really know deep down are outmoded.
We're going to open up for the audience here in just a minute. So, quick answers to two simple questions. What if you were talking to someone about having their data put into a big data repository now, and they were concerned about privacy and confidentiality? What would you say? You can start, since you're directly.
I would emphasize the balance of the pros versus cons, which is that the element of privacy versus the advantage for future therapies and for the person's individual health care. And I think that most people, at least those that have significant health issues, would be willing to accept that, and if it means securing improved health care for them moving forward. So, you know, I think that overall patients are striving to get the best option available in terms of the therapies available to them. And if it's explained in that light, then absolutely. Now, obviously, there's going to have to be a balance, which is the ensuring that to minimize in terms of privacy as much as possible. But the collection itself, absolutely, I think that patients overall would accept that balance.
I would add to what he said, absolutely true. But the thing that we're getting back from people is that they would like to do that, but they're afraid of where the data is going to go. Many of them think that if they answer a question here, then it's going to show up in their life insurance or someplace else. So I think the blocks and the regulations and the security that's in place for the data, and that the data in most instances is de-identified because many people don't understand that. A full explanation really needs to happen, and I think that will help people to feel more comfortable signing in. I know myself, I have trouble now when I go into a new app and it says it wants to invade my phone and go to my pictures and everything. I'm like, why? Why are you going there? And if I don't say yes, I don't get the app. So I think we have to explain to people why and what's the privacy around that.
Rachel? Yeah.
I think most of us have been patients at one point or another, and sometimes things don't go well. The only thing that can come out of that that's positive is learning from it for the next person. So in many ways, it's really a privilege to be able to contribute data. That's one point. And I think the second point is to the privacy and security. The person who helped us out on Sentinel, who's now with the Office of Civil Rights, made a very important point. There are other ways to protect patients and consumers than simply sequestering the data, and we probably haven't been sufficiently imaginative about doing that.
Does anyone disagree with my view that we should no longer, I mean, I've heard people say we can guarantee the security of your data. I just don't think that we can make that claim now. I think the better way to say it is we're doing everything humanly possible under a set of rules to minimize the risk, which is a different message, but I don't see any way around it given the complexity of cybersecurity.
Just one additional point to the last question. I think that there would be value in the eyes of patients that if there are certain safeguards in place, with the default being not to further utilize the data without getting permission again from the patient, and that's explained in advance, and that's the way that it's constructed, then that would have value. In other words, to address the concern of the fact that it's going to be utilized in other areas, that's made very clear up front, and that's actually applied, which is that if it is utilized in any other setting, then we're going to come back to the patient and once again ask for permission to utilize that data.
I think that's right in principle. I think there is a pragmatic part to this, which is if the data are really going to be very valuable for the sorts of things we're talking about, that initial consent needs to be broad enough to allow the broad utility. Otherwise, it becomes impossible to keep going back and asking, I think, in the scale we're talking about. Very difficult.
Well, I think we want to go to the audience now, but I'll just, the one thing I want to add in is in all the discussions about precision medicine initiative, it became clear there's a small segment of Americans who really don't want their data used for anybody else, even if the other person's dying and their data could save it, but it's a very small fraction. There's a large segment who are data liberators who would just want to have their data used and they don't care. Then there's a very large segment that wants the in-between. And I think we all look forward to the day when the permission system is also fluent, just like the information systems are, so that people so we can do what you described in an automated fashion, sort of like the apps on your phone if you say no, where it would really be no.
I think maybe if you show them what the DNC and the RNC have, then maybe that would also be compelling.
There's a reason, well, by the way, I'm not associated with either campaign. I just have, it's been fascinating to me to hear about this. Okay, let's go to the audience.
Great, thank you. John Hernandez from Verily. We heard from most of the panelists about the desirability and the importance of having more patient-reported outcomes data and the question of why that isn't happening. I think back to some of the well-intentioned and very scientifically written FDA guidance on patient-reported outcomes, and having been on the industry side, the millions of dollars that would be required to meet all of those requirements for labeling claims, and it's very easy to see why companies don't do that. So I wonder if there are additional actions that can be taken, more of a lighter touch, if you will, to actually encourage more of this for labeling purposes.
I think I can comment to see if Rachel agrees. I think a well-intentioned effort to make PROs very scientific led to a situation where the industry was greatly disincentivized from even approaching the topic, and we've taken that lesson to heart at FDA. It's still a work in progress, mostly being mediated through the patient-focused drug development effort to figure out how to come to measures that are scientifically reliable so in some cases automate things like promise in a way that it can really be used. But it's work in progress, but the lesson was clearly learned that if you make it so rigorous that no one can afford to do it, they won't do it. Rachel, is that fair?
I think that's completely correct. And also, one would ask, what was the value gained in making it that rigorous? It's not only that it is hard to do, but were we actually gaining something we needed in all those cases?
Mark Berger, Vice President, Real World Data and Analytics at Pfizer. Thanks for the shout out earlier, Rob. The world of real world data is evolving so much faster than this panel seems to be talking about it. And at Pfizer, I have access to very, very large de-identified data sets, several EHR data sets, many administrative claims data sets, survey data sets. And even now, a fairly large linked EHR claims data set. And within EHR data, more than 70% of the information is in free text notes. One of the services that I have 30,000 NLP concepts, so that I actually can mine a tremendous amount of data out of those notes. And our partner company will do additional NLP concepts for us as we need it. So our data set is really, really rich. We can answer different questions. And I think that a lot of people, researchers even, haven't had an experience with those kinds of rich data sets. And I know the FDA is talking to some of these groups, particularly in the oncology space, about looking at EHR data for looking for biomarkers and whatnot. But the world is changing so fast, and it's happening in the private sector because there's a business model for someone to collect, aggregate, curate, de-identify, and use that data to inform decision making. So an example, we published a paper where we looked at patients who were being treated for rheumatoid arthritis. We know that they got a prescription written. We also could see in the claims whether they got it filled. Half the patients for TNF inhibitors never got a prescription filled. You could only answer that question in a linked claims EHR data set. And we're answering many other questions, even about rare diseases, because we can mine those text notes. I think that the discussion we're having here is, yes, EHR data is getting better. There's a lot of sparseness in the data. There's missing data. It's not perfect. But the richness of the data is so great that we are really being penny wise and pound foolish by not really going after this in an intensive way to try and actually study how healthcare is delivered, how to make it more effective, more efficient. The time is now, and we can start doing it now.
I'm glad to hear you're so enthusiastic. I agree completely, but I want to just challenge you on one thing. When you say de-identified, what do you really mean now? Because when you have rich data like that, I don't believe that it's really not identifiable.
So we can agree, Rob. You know, there were those scientists who published their DNA whole genomes on the web, and somebody was able to use publicly available information, and guessing what he knew, he was able to identify those people. Any data can be re-identified. The question is it being adequately protected, and are the people using that data trying to re-identify it? We have no interest in re-identifying the data. But it's HIPAA-compliant data, and it's de-identified to, and we can't get, so in order to make it some restrictions, we can't get data down to a zip code. We can get it to, maybe a census tract. So there's no complete protection. My bank account was hacked. My bank is JP Morgan Chase. Medicare was hacked. The White House has been hacked. If really malefactors want to do something, they'll get in.
WikiLeaks yesterday morning about it. It came to light that But Mark, I know you'll have to, later on, the other things you told me I think are fascinating about some of your ideas about how to make it more just not dredging through tons of data and publishing or putting things forward that look favorable to a product. But could you just comment quickly, since I won't be here the rest of the day, assuming there's richness to all this data, has Pfizer figured out how to get health systems in America to actually participate in prospective research other than just paying a huge amount of money to get it done?
So there are challenges we have within the economic incentives that are laid out within the healthcare system. And so let's even take something really simple. You talk about collecting patient-reported outcomes in the context of an EHR data set. Where that's been done multiple times, I'm not involved with this, but I know about these cases, it doesn't work. Why? It adds work onto the doctor, and the doctor doesn't get anything immediately back that helps him to take care of the patient. An exception to this was at Cleveland Clinic, where they did something in their rehab program to have 5 questions added in, which actually helped them manage their patients. And guess what? They collect all that data. So data is collected when there's a good incentive. The reason why claims data is complete is, guess what? People get paid money when you file a claim, okay? EHR data, people are not getting paid for filling out everything perfectly. And if you're going to ask them to add more stuff in up front, you're going to have to make it easier for them and better for them to deliver care to the patients. Because when you go to a doctor who has an EHR now, fortunately not mine, I fired the last one, they ask you a question. Then they ask you a question. They don't even have a relationship with the patient anymore. It's about establishing a relationship in a therapeutic. How can you do that if you're a slave to entering things into the computer?
All right, you answered the question. Pfizer has not figured it out. But neither has anyone else, as far as so I still think that is the #1 challenge, because I completely agree with you that it's moving fast on the data front. Marty.
Hi, I'm Marty Rose. I'm from FDA in the Division of Cardiovascular and Renal Products. So before I go on, I'm going to tell you what I'm not going to say, which is I'm not going to talk about regulation of registries, but I have a question about them. Before I went to cardiorenal drugs, I did a lot of work with NORD and the constituents of NORD, a few of the small organizations. It would seem to me that NORD would have a really big incentive to have its constituents create registries that have the data that could lead to the approval of drugs for those conditions. And I would hope that FDA, I know, has long had close relationships with NORD. I would hope that we try to convince them that that's a good idea and that they work towards that.
Comment directly on that, because that's where I spent yesterday morning. And in fact, I'm pleased to say FDA actually got Congress to allocate in the budget funding for development of natural history registries for rare diseases. NORD is hard at work to do this. Again, it's a complicated problem because you got 5,000 or so diseases. And I would also add something Mark said I think is really critical, and Russell Rothman may comment on this later from the perspective of PCORNet. But in addition to registries, a way to find people with rare diseases is going to be through the big data warehouses, where a lot of work still needs to be done on computable phenotypes. So the FDA and NIH are both funding it. NORD is on the case. The one problem, Patrick, not to pick on you, that NORD says it's having is that industry wants to control the data in the registries, because for the registries to be ultimately useful, they got to be, for people with no treatments for their diseases, they want them to be in cahoots with industry. So they've had trouble getting industry to let NORD be the keeper because it's representing the patients, not the company. Is that?
I'm not aware of that, and if you want my view on it, I think it's wrong. I mean, I think we should make those data available, and the reason is that not just for the drugs coming through for rare diseases, but of course it's increasingly the case that those rare diseases give massive insight into causal pathways for common diseases or common phenotypes, and that's a paradigm of drug discovery and development that's going to get much more common. And so that becomes a resource on which you can actually then improve the possibility of making medicines across the board, including for rare diseases. So I think that's a sort of foundational part of the system that we need to have, and I think keeping it secret, and it goes back actually to the point Mark was raising, I don't think there's a lot of value in companies building up bespoke data sets that only they can look at for this, because ultimately you're going to want to look at it, payers are going to want to look at it, healthcare systems are going to want to look at it, and if you can't, it's of limited value. Science has to be such that you can reproduce it and look at it again from a different angle.
Okay. Thank
But
you.
great minds think alike. This is good. Ross.
Ross McKinney, the Association of American Medical Colleges. And one of our goals is to be able to use academic medical centers to work more efficiently, to gather information to improve care. And as I see what we want to achieve in real-world evidence, I'd be interested in the panel's impression. My view is there are two things that are huge barriers that keep people from being able to do it as part of routine. One is we are still dealing with the EHR and the mechanisms of capture. Most of us don't have Pfizer's capability to search through fields. We don't have the computer power. We don't have the money to do that kind of free-form searching. So instead, we force the person who is trying to enter data on a prospectively designed study to put things into fields that require more time on the part of the investigator. They don't really want to do it. The second thing is, as soon as we declare the prospective intent to learn how to take care of a patient, we create a need to consent. We create an artificial system that generates massive amounts of work for lots of people and ultimately doesn't actually protect anybody, in most cases, from particularly if we're doing comparisons within the standard of care. We are simply generating work and blocking progress because we're making an assumption that we can work without evidence and know the right answer. So how do we get the rules changed so that we can more efficiently work in a real-world environment to do prospective studies and get the answers that we'd like to so that we can better take care of people. And I might say one way to do that is to engage the public as you design the study so that we could consider having pre-review instead of having the IRB act as the gatekeeper. Instead, use the communities of people who'd be likely affected by the outcomes.
I should let the other panelists speak first if you have a response. Okay, I have a couple of comments. Since we picked on everybody else, let me just pick on academic medical centers for a minute. Part of what I was trying to show with the networking is that if you look at America, and there's another issue of globalization I hope you all will get to later in the day, because let's say we solve this problem from America. We're 4.5% of the world's population. It's got to somehow interdigitate with all these other people in the world. But just fixating on America for a minute, look at Washington, D.C. It's Inova, Hopkins, and MedStar. If you're not an employee of one of those, you're a boutique doctor, and there's still some of those. Rachel knows some fairly well. But and they all want medical schools if they don't have them. Even Kaiser, is building a medical school now, and there's a good reason for it. It should be the brain center. But academic medical centers often act like they're powerless supplicants of some system that they don't control. When if you look at the revenue of these systems, they're all making more than $3 billion a year in revenue. In the case of Pitt, it's like $14 billion a year, and Hopkins is $11 billion or something. These are big corporations. Why don't they deal with this, is one question. So, but then, now that I've attacked everybody, I think there is a special kabuki that goes on that, I hope the new common rule will resolve. As you know, it's in gestation. And it plays out in registries in a really weird way. So the way you get registries used for research is you say, we're creating a registry for quality of care so we don't need consent. And then the day later you say, oh, by the way, we've got this registry. We could use it for research, and it's too late to get consent because the data is already collected. And that is a workaround for the fundamental issue that you're raising, which is how do we develop a facile learning system where people sort of sign up for learning, and then they only get specific consent for the things that really matter, which I think should be an articulated goal of the system. We do have a special issue at FDA. We have regulations that prohibit us from using registries the way we should. It's in a bill which is before Congress now, and I can't make a comment about legislation other than just to note that it's there. John, you're in an academic medical center.
We have a wonderful bureaucracy.
And your system is, I mean, I know it well for a lot of reasons. My kids and grandkids get care there. It's growing like wildfire, and it's probably a $5 or $6 billion system now. So it should have some power to fix these things.
Well, it gets into governance and priorities of the system. Many of the priorities in these evolving healthcare systems is increasing market share, and that leads to a set of behaviors that is very different and has really transformed what is traditionally an academic medical center into a business model that has played out in a variety of different ways. So we don't have the answers there. But I would hope that this bill you're talking about goes forward, because that does help reduce some of the barriers we have about developing a learning healthcare system where we can gather and use data efficiently.
So I think you've set a, Ross is new at AAMC. For those who don't know him, he used to oversee IRBs. So I think you've set a marker down for work for AAMC that we look forward to working with you on. Jesse.
Hi, Jesse Berlin. I head epidemiology for Johnson & Johnson, including device epidemiology. So the first thing I want to do is thank you for your efforts in bringing unique device identifiers, moving that along, because we're starving for data. And the discrepancy in what we can do in large data sets between drugs and devices is really a problem. But that's an aside. So one comment with respect to this issue of incentives for entering data. In the UK, I'm not saying that they've solved the problem completely, but through the CPRD, the Clinical Practices Research Data Link, which is a large GP-based EMR, EHR system, the clinicians actually do get an incentive for providing accurate data and complete data. So they seem to have worked that out, at least partially there. So that's a comment. The question gets back to this issue of being able to, let's say, bring disparate data sources together to perform analyses on much larger data sets using common methodology. And Rachel, you'll know where I'm going with this. There's this concept of the common data model, which doesn't exactly get to interoperability per se, but where you map concepts from each of these different data sources into a common format with common definitions. And I'm just curious whether the panel has any thoughts as to how far, and it seems to me that that's where Sentinel has gone, that's where Odyssey has gone, and unfortunately the two common data models are not the same, so I'm not sure how common they are. But is that at least a partial solution to some of this?
Yeah, I think that was the lesson. It is unfortunate two common data models aren't the same. It's much easier to map from one to another than to map from total chaos. So yeah, we firmly believe that's a very sensible and implementable approach.
Can I comment on both those? On the CPRD thing, I think one of the reasons it works in part is that the computer system is absolutely part of how the GPs have to practice. So you can't do your job without it, so they enter it. But there are some examples in there which show the problem, which is dates are extremely inaccurate in that system because there's no billing. And so the dates are when somebody chooses to enter the information. So there are some things that are good and there are some things that are bad. And on the interoperability thing, exactly the same problem exists. So you've got CPRD, you've got UK Biobank with 500,000 people more intensely phenotyped in groups and things like 100,000 genomes. Interoperability is a massive problem between those data sets at the moment, to which I think in the UK there is no answer at the moment, and but people are looking at it. It's clearly going to be a common problem across all of these things, that I think there's a need for a lot more crosstalk, because then the next question is, can you integrate across countries rather than within?
Yeah, I have a few comments on this because I think it's a critical issue. And Jesse, this is what I'm very positive about this because I think John made the good case, and you'll hear more from people like John White about the upfront getting better data into systems. This is what I meant by the back end. And you know, the thing that drives it for me is that health systems are going to have to do this to survive in the new CMS environment. They're going to have curate data for higher and higher quality data on the back end. And you'll hear from PCORnet, which is another example, Sentinel. There are other examples out there, and a large part of what we're trying to work on now is we're calling it data for dummies. But the common data models are not that different. They're mostly mapping to the same concepts, so there's real opportunity here to link these big systems. For example, why should we have a CTSA system with $600 million a year of taxpayer money going to a group of centers, and then you have PCORnet, also with taxpayer and insurance dollars, often co-located in the same institution with different models? It would seem like if the data models would be close to the same, or at least interoperable on the back end, that then you could spend your money on how do you incent clinicians to get prospective consent and the other things that came up. So that's very much in our thinking. But at least the reason I feel so optimistic about a tipping point is both of these are happening at the same time, and they don't have to completely get there, but I think iteratively they'll both get better, and we'll eventually get to this possibility of a national system. The question about international, though, is still an issue there, and it's hard enough to deal with America, so I'm just going to stick with that for now. But we know these things have to work across countries, too, because diseases don't know boundaries and markets are global. Yes, last question, and then it's break time.
Thanks. My name is John Birch, spelled with a U for those who remember. And I am an angel investor. I'm a member of the Mid-America Angels in Kansas City and of the Angel Capital Association, which is a national group representing over 100,000 organized angel investors. It's an under-recognized resource. I'm not here to promote that, just that that's my background, because collectively we probably fund hundreds of thousands of entrepreneurs each year. And there's a great deal of frustration in the M-Health, digital health space among entrepreneurs because of the quality of data that they have to work with. Enough said on that general point. I have 2 points, comments I'd like to make. One is that please don't assume, and I don't think John White will allow you to assume that the evolution of EMRs is over. That evolution is not going to be over until we have patient-centric repositories of data. The number and quantity and significance of problems that patient centricity of data solves is just astounding. I've done some brainstorming on that, and it's just amazing. And that's very different from collecting the data from where it's been collected. It requires collecting it where the patients put it. People are working on that, entrepreneurs are working on that, investors are working on that, and I think solutions will be coming along to provide such data sources. As to decision support, there exists a black market in apps among medical students that is not a problem, but it's just something that indicates the need for what I call cognitive automation. Now this is kind of a big picture idea, but the only way to lower the costs of healthcare and yet continue to improve the quality of healthcare is cognitive automation, to automate the tasks of medicine, most of which are cognitive. And that was a point that was made by a badly neglected National Research Council report that came out, I think in 2008, actually, the need for cognitive computing. And I'm not just talking about what Dr. Watson or what I think Dr. Google may be working on as well, but I'm talking about decision-making aids for doctors that can allow them to process all the data. If we have longitudinal patient-centric data on someone my age, we're going to have 60-some years of data. There's no way a human being can process that. And that industry is waiting to come into existence because of the problem you mentioned, Rhonda, of standardization. The data has to be standardized for patients across 300 million Americans. That's a challenge which investors are approaching, and it's not going to be done until you get to that point.
I imagine the panelists all agree. John, you have a quick comment?
Certainly, one of the main skills and tasks a physician performs is integrating knowledge from the patient interaction, clinical trials, guidelines, et cetera. And so decision aids that facilitate that process, I think, would be greatly appreciated as long as we understand their validation and what we expect from them, and to what degree can it capture the key elements that go into decision making, which is very individualized.
Well, I want to thank the panel. You all have done a great job of staying on task. And I wish I could stay for the rest of the day, but I will be following up. I think the FDA is vitally interested in this area, and so the examples that you all are going to go through today, I think, have been very carefully crafted to show the reality of where we are with specific applications of this kind of thinking. So thanks again. Let's adjourn for break.